For your ears only for the week of January 13th, I'm David Alpern.
I'm Catherine Herzog.
Chuck Hagel's leadership of our military would be historic. He'd be the first person of enlisted rank to serve as Secretary of Defense, one of the few secretaries who've been wounded in war, and the first Vietnam veteran to lead the department.
I like Chuck Hagel. He served with distinction in Vietnam as a enlisted man, 2 Purple Hearts. But quite frankly, Chuck Hagel is out of the mainstream of thinking, I believe, on most issues.
Actually, Defense Secretary Bill Perry in the Clinton administration began his military career as an enlisted man. But President Obama was otherwise on point last week about putting someone with a foxhole view of war, and especially the failure of Vietnam, in charge of today's Pentagon. And complaints of critics like South Carolina's Republican Senator Lindsey Graham will doubtless run up against the fact that Hagel's thinking on many issues, including the limits of military force and the new dynamics of the Middle East, are comfortably close to those of the president himself.
Obama underscored the point last week after a meeting with Afghanistan's President Hamid Karzai when he announced a speeding up of U.S. troop withdrawal there, despite conservative calls for staying on to finish the job, and the Pentagon's own report that Afghan forces are still far from ready to stand on their own. There may also be confrontations over the nominations for CIA and Treasury, and perhaps other top spots as well. To consider all this and related developments, for your ears only, we're joined again by Princeton Professor of History and Public Affairs, Julian Zelizer, author of Jimmy Carter, Governing America, and Arsenal of Democracy. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Are the complaints about Hagel's cautious approach on Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, Israel, precisely the message Obama wants to send with his nomination, and that of Democratic Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts, also a decorated Vietnam vet, to be Secretary of State?
I think that's right. I think his nomination and Senator Kerry do send a signal. On the one hand, both are internationalists. They're committed to the role of the U.S. in the world. They are far from being isolationists, but both are veterans who are skeptical about the use of military power and thinks that it needs to be used strategically and wisely. And that goes back to 2008. It's a message that in some ways was lost, but I think President Obama wants to reiterate that again.
The Republicans are effectively blocked from opposing Kerry because they touted him so strongly as an alternative to UN Ambassador Susan Rice after her statements about murders at the U.S. consulate in Benghazi. But will that issue come up at his hearings?
It might. It's one of the foreign policy issues, one of the few foreign policy issues that Republicans feel they have gained some traction with President Obama, whereas otherwise he has a pretty successful record in much of the counterterrorism program. So it might come back, but it is difficult in that he did select the alternative they wanted. So he's, stolen some of their thunder.
Does Obama's announcement of accelerated withdrawal from Afghanistan give Hagel effective cover for his own caution about military solutions?
For sure. In the end, the Secretary of Defense carries out the policies of the president rather than vice versa. So the president has now set up the context for Hagel, and it makes it harder for Republicans to paint Hagel as someone who's going to dramatically reverse what the president has already announced.
You also wrote last week that Republicans could cost themselves considerable credibility by opposing a fellow Republican and a genuine Vietnam hero. Talk about that and why there's such vehemence against Hagel nonetheless.
Well, first of all, Republicans are just trying to rebuild themselves on national security since Iraq. So the optics, as people say, of the party taking on a Vietnam veteran and someone who's been pretty hawkish for much of his career, I think won't look good for the GOP. And it will allow Obama to position himself as the person who's defending veterans, who's defending the generation of Americans who fought in war. And second, it will bring back the question of Iraq. The reason people don't like Hagel and the Republican Party really is his opposition in the end to the Iraq war as it unfolded. And the last thing Republicans want right now is to bring back memories and discussion of an unpopular war.
Of course, the other thing is that Hagel backed Obama against McCain, which gives you some motivation there.
Absolutely. And so, here's someone who's a solid Republican, but has a lot of opponents, both for his decision in 2008, for his opposition to Iraq, and of course, personally, he's someone who didn't get along with a lot of people on Capitol Hill. He always liked to go his own way.
By proposing National Security Advisor John Brennan to head the CIA, is Obama inviting more scrutiny of the drone attacks that have eliminated so many suspected terrorists, but also innocent civilians, especially if drones are seen as replacements for U.S. forces fighting the Taliban.
He might. I mean, Brennan is someone who's been pretty tough on counterterrorism. Originally, he wasn't nominated because of his statements on the use of enhanced interrogation techniques, i.e. torture. But most of that criticism about drone strikes will come from the left. And I think President Obama is pretty much in a position where he accepts that kind of criticism and thinks he's insulated from it politically. It's not going to do anything to him at this point.
The drone issue also does involve secrecy and the administration's refusal to release documents that they say authorize the killing of even U.S. citizens without formal trials or even charges. Does Brennan's confirmation present an opportunity for the left to make such material public?
It is. I mean, he is someone, in the same way Republicans don't like Hagel, a lot of people on the left don't like Brennan. They don't like his role in this administration, and they certainly don't like him as the head of the CIA. So it brings up all kinds of issues, from interrogation to drones to secrecy. But I think President Obama still, and he's always been this way, feels confident he can take heat from the left. And his real focus right now is on counteracting conservatives and undercutting any message from Republicans that they're tougher on national security.
There's also brewing opposition to White House Chief of Staff Jack Lew as Treasury Secretary. He's clearly a master of the federal budget, but without experience in the private sector or international finance. He also reportedly played pretty rough in recent deficit negotiations. What do you expect there?
Yeah, a lot of conservatives don't like Lew. He's a tough liberal. He's someone who knows the budget. He knows Washington. He's also an adamant defender of policies like Social Security, and he showed in the recent round of budget wars that he is going to stand firm on those kinds of issues. So they're worried about this. They're worried not just because of his positions, but he's effective. So they're going to focus on issues like his private experience, and they're going to try to use that, but I don't think it's going to go very far. I think he's someone with pretty heavy and solid credentials that will go through the process pretty easily.
And what about the absence of women among all the new Obama cabinet nominations?
That is interesting. Obviously, the administration says there are a lot of women and African Americans still in place who are not going to be replaced. He's gotten some heat. We're still talking about a handful of appointments at this point. So let's see if there's any more on the horizon. But again, otherwise, this is the kind of criticism. This is primarily from liberals that the president feels his credentials are strong enough in the Democratic Party that he can take some criticism and do just fine.
It was off the main screen last week, but what do you see developing on the deficit, the debt ceiling limit, the continuing budget battle?
Well, you know, there's some who say Republicans are a little skittish and nervous about doing this again, and some Republicans are saying let's raise the debt ceiling and not force talks on the budget. But the budget talks are going to happen. The deal on the fiscal cliff did not deal with the spending side of the ledger, so we know those debates are coming. They might be connected to the debt ceiling, they might not. But we're in now for at least 2 to 3 months of debate, fierce ones, over what parts of the budget to cut, from defense to Social Security to other kinds of social programs. And I think the battle could be pretty brutal in Washington.
Princeton professor of history and public affairs Julian Zelizer. His books include Arsenal of Democracy, Jimmy Carter, and Governing America.
Quote from the news, Jack assures me that he is going to work to make at least one letter legible in order not to debase our currency. That was President Obama joking about the loopy signature of Jack Lew, nominated to be Treasury Secretary with his name on paper money.
Next, medicine for the mortgage mess, for your ears only.